Joshua. When everything is falling apart around you, there's one thing you don't want standing next to you, someone who's still deciding whether God can be trusted. Joshua already decided. A long time ago, by the time he led Israel into Canaan, Joshua wasn't a young man testing his faith for the first time. He'd watched the Red Sea split. He'd eaten bread that fell from the sky. He'd seen water come out of a rock. And when 12 spies came back from Canaan, and 10 of them said it was impossible, Joshua was one of 2 men who said otherwise. Not because he was naive, because he'd already done the math and handed it to God. That's what you want beside you in a crisis. Not the loudest person, not the most experienced person, the most decided one. Here's what makes Joshua specifically dangerous to any problem you're facing. God's instruction to him in Joshua 1:8 wasn't sharpen your sword or study your enemy. It was, keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night. Stay saturated in what God said. Because Joshua's edge in every battle was never military strategy. It was that he operated from a completely different information source than everyone else in the room. And then in Joshua 1:9, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Notice God says that before a single wall falls, before a single battle is won, the confidence came first, the victory followed. The walls of Jericho didn't fall because of clever tactics. They fell because a man obeyed an instruction that made no logical sense, marching in silence for 7 days, and never once questioned whether God meant what he said. That's not recklessness, that's a weapon. And if we're honest, most of us in a crisis are still negotiating with God, still running the numbers, still asking whether his word actually applies to this specific situation. Joshua had stopped having that conversation years before the crisis arrived. You want Joshua on your side because when the walls look unbreakable, he's already decided they're coming down. Paul seems to do his best work when things are worst, and that's not a coincidence. It's a pattern that runs through every season of his life. Imprisoned, he writes letters that have shaped Christianity for 2,000 years. Shipwrecked, he's the one calming everyone else down. Beaten, abandoned, left for dead, he gets back up and keeps going. By any human measure, Paul's life looks like a series of disasters, but Paul had a completely different way of measuring what was happening to him. Philippians 4:11, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. That word learned is worth sitting with. Paul didn't arrive at that place naturally or easily. It was forged through shipwrecks and prison cells and beatings and betrayal and years of carrying the weight of churches that sometimes turned on him. Contentment wasn't his personality. It was his hard-won theology, something beaten into shape by circumstances that would have destroyed most people. Acts 27 shows it in real time. The ship is breaking apart. Experienced sailors are terrified. Every person on board has abandoned hope. And Paul, the prisoner, the one with the least obvious authority in the room, stands up and speaks. Verse 25, take courage, men, for I believe God that it will be exactly as I have been told. He wasn't minimizing the storm. He wasn't pretending the situation wasn't serious. He simply had information nobody else in that room had access to. And that information changed the entire atmosphere on that ship. That's what Paul brings into any crisis. Not the absence of danger, but an unshakable orientation toward what God has already spoken. A settled confidence that has been tested so many times, it no longer startles easily. You want Paul on your side because he's already been through the version of this that was worse, and God came through every single time. Peter almost didn't make this list, and if we're only looking at the first half of his story, honestly, he probably shouldn't. He's impulsive, overconfident, famous for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. He cut off a servant's ear in Gethsemane when Jesus had already surrendered. He sank walking on water the moment he shifted his eyes from Jesus to the waves beneath him, and then, his worst moment, he denied Christ 3 times. Not under military interrogation, not facing execution, in a courtyard to a servant girl by a fire, and then went outside and wept bitterly. And that's not a crisis asset. That's the person you're quietly hoping doesn't make things worse. But that's only half of Peter's story, and the second half is what earns him a place here. The man who hid behind locked doors after the crucifixion is the same man who stood up on Pentecost and preached to thousands without a tremor in his voice. Fully restored, completely transformed. Acts 2:14. Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and addressed the crowd. Same Peter. Unrecognizable from who he was before. What changed everything was a moment on a beach in John 21. Jesus finds him specifically, goes looking for him, and asks him 3 questions, one for every denial. Simon, son of John, do you love me? not to shame him, not to catalog his failures, to restore him completely and recommission him publicly. That exchange is what makes Peter dangerous in a crisis, not his boldness, his restoration. A person who has been fully broken and fully rebuilt by grace carries something inside them that comfort and success simply cannot produce. They know from the inside out that God doesn't discard the people he loves when they fall. You want Peter on your side because the enemy's greatest weapon in a crisis is convincing you that your past failures have already decided your future. Peter is living proof that they haven't. Deborah. There's a particular kind of person who only reveals what they're made of when things get bad. You didn't see it coming, and then the crisis hits, and suddenly they are the calmest, clearest person in the room. Deborah wasn't that person. She didn't discover who she was when the crisis arrived. She was already there, already judging disputes under a palm tree, already prophesying, already trusted before a single enemy showed up. Judges 4 introduces her almost casually. She was leading Israel at that time. No fanfare, no origin story, just a woman already doing the work. In a crisis, the most dangerous gap isn't the size of the threat. It's the time it takes people to find their footing. Panic spreads fast, and while everyone around you is still catching up, you need someone already standing. Deborah was already standing. When the crisis came, 900 iron chariots, a situation that looked completely unwinnable, Israel's own military commander refused to move without her. That's not weakness on Barak's part, that's discernment. He recognized something in Deborah he knew he didn't have, and she didn't hesitate, she didn't negotiate. Judges 4:9, she went, from the front. Her power wasn't volume or aggression, it was certainty. She told Barak in Judges 4:14, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands." Past tense, battle hadn't started, already speaking like it was over, because anchored to what God had spoken, it was. That kind of certainty isn't something you find on the day of the crisis. It's built quietly in the ordinary moments nobody sees. When real pressure hits, most of us start renegotiating with God. Suddenly the promises feel like they need reevaluating. Deborah never did that. You want Deborah on your side because panic never touched her. And that kind of calm doesn't just steady one person, it steadies everyone standing near her. Moses. Moses is the anchor of this list, and in many ways, the most honest one. Because Moses didn't want the job. When God called him at the burning bush, his first response wasn't courage or readiness. It was a list of reasons why God had the wrong person. Exodus 4:10, "I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." This is the man who would part a sea, call down plagues, and lead 2 million people through a wilderness for 40 years. And his opening position was essentially, "You've made a mistake." What's striking is how God responded to that. He didn't argue with Moses' assessment of himself. He didn't list Moses' strengths or build him up with encouragement. Exodus 4:11, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." God simply redirected his focus. The question was never about Moses' ability. It was always about God's. That reframe is everything. And it's the thing that makes Moses the most valuable person on this entire list. Because what Moses carried into every impossible situation wasn't talent or natural leadership, it was access. Exodus 33:11 describes something almost incomprehensible. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend, not through visions or distant thunder, face to face. Like a conversation between two people who know each other deeply. In a crisis, that kind of intimacy with God isn't just an advantage. It's the only advantage that actually matters when everything else has run out. And that intimacy wasn't handed to Moses because he was special. It was built through decades of showing up, through burning bushes and wilderness wanderings and moments of profound doubt where he kept returning to God anyway. You want Moses on your side because he learned the most important lesson a crisis can teach, that the outcome was never about him. And the moment he stopped trying to make it about him, the seas started parting. Elijah. On paper, Elijah might be the most dangerous person on this list to have in your corner, and that's exactly why you want him there. This is the man who stood alone against 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. No backup, no contingency plan, just a prayer and complete confidence that God would answer. And in 1 Kings 18:37, he prays the most direct prayer in the entire scene. "Answer me, Lord, answer me." That's it. No lengthy petition, no negotiating, just a man so certain of who God is that he asked simply and expected fully. The fire fell, the prophets were defeated, Israel saw it with their own eyes, and then, almost immediately after his greatest victory, Elijah collapsed under a tree and asked God to let him die. Same man, same faith, completely spent. What's fascinating about that moment is what God did next. He didn't rebuke him, didn't lecture him, didn't remind him of what he'd just accomplished on that mountain. He gave him food, water, and rest, and then sent him back out. First, Kings 19:5. An angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." There's something deeply human about that exchange. God meeting exhaustion with gentleness rather than disappointment. Treating the crash not as a character failure, but as a physical reality that needed tending before anything else could happen. Most people who've lived long enough know that pattern. The season of real victory followed by the crash nobody saw coming. The moment after the breakthrough where the energy just leaves. And in that emptiness, the enemy whispers that maybe God is finished with you, that the best moments are behind you. When that you burned too bright, and now there's nothing left. Elijah's story answers that whisper directly. God didn't replace him, didn't disqualify him. He fed him, rested him, and commissioned him again. The same man who called fire from heaven went on to anoint kings and raise up Elisha, his successor who would carry the work even further. You want Elijah on your side, not just because he can shift the atmosphere in a crisis, but because he's the living proof that God doesn't abandon the people he's called, even when they're sitting in the dirt convinced the journey is over. Daniel. Daniel might be the most quietly formidable person on this entire list, not because he's dramatic or loud, but because absolutely nothing breaks him, taken from his homeland as a teenager, dropped into a foreign empire with a completely different language, culture, and religion, surrounded by pressure to compromise at every level, what he ate, how he prayed, who he bowed to, and Daniel just didn't, not once. Not in the small moments nobody was watching. Not in the large moments everyone was. What makes him so valuable in a crisis is what he built before the crisis arrived. Daniel 6:10 is one of the most understated verses in Scripture. When a law was signed making his prayers illegal, punishable by death, Daniel went home, opened his window toward Jerusalem, and prayed, just like he always had. That phrase carries everything, just like he always had. His response to a death threat wasn't some heroic departure from his normal routine. It simply was his normal routine, continued without interruption. That's not willpower. That's a life so consistently oriented toward God that even mortal danger couldn't redirect it, and it traces all the way back to Daniel 1:8. Daniel resolved not to defile himself. One quiet, private decision, made long before the lions, long before the kings and the visions and the impossible interpretations that would define his life. A young man deciding in private who he was going to be, before anyone was watching and before anything was at stake. That's where Daniel's crisis strength actually came from. Not from the moment itself, but from 10,000 ordinary moments that preceded it. Each one small, each one unwitnessed, each one adding another layer to something that eventually became completely unshakable. Most of us want that kind of faith without the process that produces it. We want the lion's den courage without the years of quiet faithfulness that made it possible. You want Daniel on your side because he already won the battle most of us are still fighting. And he won it long before anyone knew there was a battle coming. Esther. Esther doesn't make this list because she was the most powerful person in the room. She makes it because she understood something most people never learn under pressure, that timing and positioning matter more than force. When the genocide of her entire people was signed into law, she didn't rush in, she didn't react. She called a 3-day fast, gathered those closest to her, and moved at exactly the right moment with exactly the right words. That kind of measured, spirit-guided restraint is extraordinarily rare when everything is on the line. Mordecai's words to her in Esther 4:14 are some of the most quietly powerful in all of Scripture. Who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? He wasn't flattering her, he was reminding her that her position wasn't accidental, but that God had been placing her long before the crisis ever arrived. Years of preparation disguised as ordinary life, leading to one moment that would determine everything, and she almost missed it. Her first response to Mordecai was essentially, "I can't. The rules won't allow it." Going to the king uninvited means death. That's not cowardice. That's a woman doing the honest math on what obedience was going to cost her. But then something shifted. Esther 4:16. If I perish, I perish. That line doesn't read like recklessness. It reads like a woman who brought her fear honestly before God during those 3 days of fasting and came out the other side having settled the outcome in her soul before she ever walked through the door. That's the move most people skip. The waiting, the fasting, the private surrender before the public moment. We want to go straight from the problem to the breakthrough without sitting in the space between them where God actually does his deepest work. You want Esther on your side because she knew that the preparation was never separate from the miracle. It was always the first part of it. Every person on this list was extraordinary. Every one of them points somewhere, and they all point to the same person. Jesus didn't just face a crisis. He walked straight into the worst one in human history, fully aware of what was coming, and didn't flinch. Not in Gethsemane, where he sweat drops of blood under the weight of what was ahead. Not before Pilate, where he stood silent and sovereign while the world decided his fate. Not on the cross, where he absorbed every consequence of every failure every person on this list ever made. John 16:33. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. That wasn't a motivational phrase. That was a man hours away from crucifixion telling his closest friends that the outcome was already settled. Here's what makes Jesus categorically different from everyone else on this list. They were with people in crisis. Jesus became the crisis, so that we wouldn't have to face the only one that actually matters alone. Romans 8:34 puts it plainly, Christ Jesus who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us right now. Not historically, present tense, interceding. And if we're honest, every crisis we face, at its deepest level, is a question. Is God actually with me in this? Has he forgotten me? Does any of this have a purpose I can't see yet? Every character on this list answered that question with their lives. But Jesus answered it with his death and resurrection. You don't just want Jesus on your side in a crisis. He's the only reason any crisis has an outcome worth trusting. Every name on this list was remarkable, but they were all, in the end, just shadows of this one.